But they don't know anything about you, I don't think. So we ought to find out a little bit about you. So, Rico, you've got a funny name. How did you get it?
Yeah, no, it is a stupid name. It's entirely my parents' fault. It's not my fault. So my dad grew tobacco in South America, and so I was christened Richard. I'm English by background, but that's Ricardo in Spanish, shortened to Rico. So it is Rico Tice. Just to say it's not Tico Rice. I've already heard someone say Tico Rice, which sounds like number 42 at the takeaway, doesn't it? But it is. Yeah. I once saw on a poster Rico Tice, which didn't fill me with encouragement, but anyway.
Yeah. Well, that's good. That's explained part of it anyway. But you must do something other than what you're doing at this moment during the week. So what's your background?
Yeah, no, I'm a vicar in central London, a number 2 at a church. Actually, the church that you see, All Souls, when the news starts, it goes over that church just as the BBC News begins. So I've been there. I really got ordained because I got a 3rd at university, so I couldn't think of many other career options. I got my 3rd, and I said to the tutor, was I close to a 2-2? He said, no, Rico, it was a very solid 3rd. So I knew then that ordination into the Church of England was the only career option available, so here I am. Yeah, and I've been at that same church for 28 years. My ambition is to be the longest-serving curate in the history of the Church of England. So I've done nearly 29 years, and if I can get to 44... I'll have the record. And there was a guy who did 44 in High Holborn, but I think I can take him. So that is my ambition. Yeah.
Well, I met my wife at All Souls Langham Place, but that's probably before you were born anyway. So there we are. Now that's what you do. And what about a family? Are you married?
Yeah, no, I'm married to Lucy, and we've got 3 children. We've got Peter, who's 11, Daniel is 9, and Mercy is 6. And of course, it's a stupid name with 2 older brothers because I spend my life going, Mercy! Leave Mercy alone! You know, so, and in fact, classic Central London, she actually slept under the stairs for 6 years. Her first 5 years, we just moved, she actually slept in a little, under the cupboard, like Harry Potter. You know, that was the only room we had in our little flat. So she'll be pretty screwed up later in life, so do pray for her. Yeah. My dad was a vicar, I slept under the stairs, you know. Yeah.
Well, that's interesting. Now, I think you're probably, I was going to say a bit of a sportsman. That's probably playing it a bit low, but you enjoy sport.
Well, I was a sportsman, but my chest is in my drawers now. I've got a furniture problem. It's all slipped. But I am, no, I did play. And in fact, I played golf today. So, so it's nice to be doing something worthwhile in the evening. But anyway, that's what I did this morning.
I remember you talking about rugby. You played a bit of rugby, I think.
Yeah, I did. I played rugby. I spent most of my time... Yeah, I was on the bench for Oxford University. I was on the bench for England students, actually. So I never quite made it. I spent my time waiting. But anyway, there we go. Yeah.
Well, that's good to know who's speaking. So Rico will be around for a while afterwards if people want to chat with him. I'm sure about that. But we better hand over to him because that's the purpose of the evening, to come and listen to what you have to say, sir.
Of course. Well, that's intimidating,
it's over
but
to
thank
you, my
you.
friend.
Thank you very much, Mike. Brilliant. I don't know if people can see. I think some people just are slightly askew. If you want to move your chair around, do so you can see me.
That, yes.
No, it's all right. Just do feel free to repark yourself. I'm going to grab some water. That would be great. Yep. Great. Just so you're not straining yourself. That would be great. Super. Great. Well, I chose the subject, why bother with a banquet at Easter, because as I grew up, I would have said, whatever is worth bothering with, it's not the Christian faith. And banquets are about celebrating things, and I just couldn't see what there was to celebrate in Christianity as I grew up. I didn't come from a particularly Christian home, although my mother took me along to church, I guess, once a month. So I used to, when I went to church, sit in church and count the bricks up the wall. Luckily, there are no bricks in here, but I would have, I just thought it was boring. So the first reason not to bother is it was boring. Why celebrate something that's boring? Secondly, I didn't think it was relevant. I couldn't see what relevance this book, written 2,000 years ago, 2,000 miles away, had to me. So in order to make it relevant, I used to sit in scripture lessons. I don't know if you had them. We had them once a week at my primary school. And I would leaf through the Bible trying to find references to rugby. I loved rugby. And I found a number I was pleased with. 1 to referees in John 9, verse 1. I knew a man blind from birth. Well, that was good. 1 to foul play in Acts 13, verse 3. So Paul and Barnabas were sent off. I thought that was great. And my favourite one was to crash tackling in Acts 20, verse 24. It's better to give than receive. And that was basically the result of 4 years of scripture. I just thought it wasn't relevant. The next issue, and I guess this is more serious, ladies and gentlemen, I just didn't think it was true. So here's the blasphemy on it. I sort of had a picture of Jesus, forgive me for saying it, but as a sort of long-haired hippie in a nightie floating round the Holy Land. And in my mind, Winnie the Pooh, the Great Limpopo River, the Three Kings, and Jesus walking on the water were all wrapped up together. So I don't know if you did this at primary school, but we used to sing and did those feet in ancient times, walk upon England's pastures green in the morning assembly. And the answer was no. No, he didn't. He never came to England. The next problem I had, again, I couldn't really celebrate it, were the clergy I knew. I mean, they were just so wet. I spent my time trying not to be wet, and they all reminded me of Rowan Atkinson in 4 Weddings and a Funeral. Do you remember the vicar in that? And I just thought they were such trips. And I spent my time trying not to be wet, so I spent my time doing things like this. And I didn't know many clergy that could do that. Actually, I've slightly concussed myself there. Do you know these? These are crushable cans. So I've got the most beaten-up car in central London. It's a Ford Fiesta 1.1. I drive through the middle of London. Someone comes up alongside in a Porsche with someone very glamorous next to them. They look across at me. I look back at them. I crush this on my head. And as we drive off, I've won. So this saves me about 100,000 quid, this does. And if you've got a dog collar on, it's even better. But it is easy to deceive people. And as I saw the Christian faith as boring, irrelevant, and untrue, as just, not in any way worthy of a banquet, one thing happened that caused me to think, actually, it's an enormous privilege to be speaking to you this evening. I really couldn't think of a greater privilege than doing that now, as we are this evening. And one thing happened. On the 6th of August, 1982, my godfather, so I guess godfathers are meant to bring you to God, who was my dad's older brother, and also, a godfather, had 4 daughters, no sons, so I felt a bit of a son to him. He died in a cliff fall. So he had a small boat. He'd emigrated to Canada. He went for a walk around a small island. He slipped on a cliff path, and he fell to his death. And that was the first time I saw my father weep when that phone call came through. And I lived in a family then. My parents were lovely, but death was a taboo subject, ladies and gentlemen. And it's a bit like the last couple of years with COVID. People sort of wake up to our fragility. I've taken at least 15 COVID funerals, and you stand at the graveside of someone who has died, and you say these words as a vicar: "As for man, his days are like grass. He flourishes like a flower of the field. The wind blows over it, and it's gone, and its place remembers it no more." So we flourish, and we're gone. And the thing about death is, and you know this, ladies and gentlemen, but it's like an assassin that takes loved ones from you. And love like that is so hard to replace. It's irreplaceable. And suddenly I was struck with this sort of paradigm shift. What do you do with death? And I realized I did not have a philosophy of life, and nor did my family, that coped with death. So that was the first issue. The second issue was that after my godfather was killed, my godmother opened up his wallet and found a list of mistress's addresses. So there was to be no funeral. So this is my childhood hero. She said, "We're not having a funeral." So his ashes were thrown over the side of his little boat with a bottle of bourbon, and that was the end of my childhood hero. But what I learned from that is that with human beings, there's a gap. There's a gap between the real and the ideal. We're not what we should be. And that came home profoundly with my godfather hero. But I was beginning to see it with myself as well. So in 1981, the year before my godfather was killed, I'd kept this diary. I don't know if you can see it here. And I kept this diary night after night, really, because I thought I was such a great bloke. I owed it to the world, to you, to future generations, to record my life. And I kept it, and I found out I was a total Burke. It was the most amazing experience. So in my diary, I would write, "Wouldn't it be wonderful if the starving were fed?" But I'd ask my parents for a larger allowance, and as you can see, I would eat it. In my diary, I would say, wouldn't it be great if there was world peace? But I'd never lay aside the weapons of malice and sarcasm I used in my own self-defense. Years later, I saw Paul the Apostle write in the letter to the Romans, I don't do the good I want to do. No, the evil I don't want to do, this I keep on doing. There's a problem. I mean, ladies and gentlemen, the statistic of the 20th century, the statistic, and gosh, we see it now with the shadow of Ukraine, is that 170 million people died violently. That's a Twin Towers a day. What do you do with that? There's this gap. This is my favorite autobiography, Lance Armstrong, you know, the cyclist, and it's entitled, It's Not About the Bike. And we now know that was true. It wasn't about the bike, was it? After the drug scandal broke. In fact, I loved the Australian lending library that after the drug scandal broke, moved this book from biography to fiction. There's a gap. What do we do with it? And I was struck recently, I read this quote from Winston Churchill. He said this after the Second World War. He wrote, "Man in this moment of his history has emerged in greater supremacy over the forces of nature than has ever dreamed of before. He has it in his power to solve quite easily the problem of his natural existence. He's conquered the wild beast. He's even conquered the insects and the microbe. There lies before him, if he wishes, a golden age of peace and prosperity. He has only to conquer his last and worst enemy, himself." And here we are. So the first issue was my godfather was killed. The second was there was a problem. We're not what we should be. The third thing that came along after that was I was trying to work out, well, what then is the point of life? You know, there's a toxicity and there's death. And my godmother, interestingly, had given me a little Good News Bible. My godmother wasn't really a churchgoer herself, so when I then said to her, she gave it to me for my confirmation. You know, there was a sort of formal confirmation we went through. And when I then said to her, look, I read that Bible a lot, she replied famously, that's not really what it's for, my godmother. Anyway, but there was one passage I kept reading as a 15, 16-year-old without any guidance. I just kept turning to it and reading it. And it's the one you've got here. I wonder if you can turn to your menus, and on the back they're beautifully put together. And if I may say, the awning is just staggering above us. And I mean, what a venue. But anyway, if you can turn to the back, here is King Solomon. And in terms of meaning of life, so I've suddenly, you know, my godfather's been killed, people are selfish, I'm thinking, what's it all about? Here is King Solomon, and this is a man, ladies and gentlemen, who has the time, money, talents, intelligence to look for meaning in life wherever it can be, he thought it could be found. We don't have that range, most of us, but he did. And he writes this book, Ecclesiastes, saying, you know, this was my search for meaning. And have a look down, because the first thing he says as he looked for meaning in life is, I thought it would be in pleasure. Do you see as we look down, I said to myself, do you see at the top there? Come now, I'll test you with pleasure to find out what's good. But that also proved to be meaningless. Laughter, I said, is madness. What does pleasure accomplish? So the first thing you can do for meaning in life is just go, you know, just have a laugh with your mates. Let's just have a laugh. But you can be having a laugh, but inside be so lonely. So King Solomon in the book of Proverbs wrote, even in laughter, the heart can ache. I took the funeral of a young man who'd committed suicide, and 48 hours before, he had been the heart and soul of the party. So just devastation among his friends. So the laughter. But secondly, he says, well, it's not having a laugh. I know what you do. Do you see the third line as we look down? I tried cheering myself with wine and embracing folly, my mind still guiding me with wisdom. So what does that mean? He says, right, the meaning of life is you go out Friday night and Saturday night and you get absolutely trashed. Just get smashed. But my mind's still guiding me with wisdom. I think that means he woke up 4 o'clock Sunday afternoon with a massive hangover and his head's going, what did you do that for? So he says, look, I tell you what, a sort of pleasure-based life, it's not about laughter, it's not about drinking, it's about sex. And have a look down, halfway through the next paragraph. Do you see 3 lines from the bottom of the next paragraph? I amassed silver and gold for myself, the treasure of kings and provinces. I acquired male and female singers and a harem as well. And look, this is misogyny, so please forgive me, but Solomon had 700 wives and 300 concubines. These women were the most beautiful women of the generation. They were given as part of treaties. I mean, it was appalling. But he took sexual pleasure to the end of the line, and he found the more you have, the less it satisfies. So he says, right, it's not actually pleasure that makes life work. What you have to do is make your mark. It's work. So he then says, I tried a work-based life. Have a look at verse 4. Can you see, the second paragraph. I undertook great projects, work. I built houses myself and planted vineyards. I made gardens of parks and planted all kinds of fruit trees in them. I made reservoirs to water, groves of flourishing trees. I bought male and female slaves and had other slaves who were born in my house. And do you see, having worked and worked and worked, do you see the last line of the paragraph? Because he arrives at what for many is the objective of work. Do you see what he writes? I became greater by far than anyone in Jerusalem before me. So Solomon walks in the room, and he is the man. I'd imagine Nelson Mandela, if he was still alive, if he walked in here now, we'd be on our feet. 28 years in prison for the sake of his people. Solomon walks in. He is the great man of his generation. And yet he finds, ladies and gentlemen, have a look down, that his work gives him pleasure. There's a joy. Do you see the last paragraph? I denied myself nothing my eyes desired. I refused my heart no pleasure. My heart took delight in all my labor, and this was the reward for all my toil. Yet when I surveyed all that my hands had done and what I toiled to achieve, everything was meaningless, a chasing after the wind. Nothing was gained under the sun. Say if you arrived this evening and you came out to the courtyard there and Mike was standing there and I was running round in circles and you said, what's that slightly overweight man doing running round in circles? And he said, oh, that's Rico, our speaker. He's just chasing the wind. Solomon says, I was chasing the wind. I achieved all this. But what was the point of it? So this is the West End cycle. I've worked in the West End for nearly 30 years now. And this is the cycle, ladies and gentlemen. People set their goals, they achieve them, they feel euphoria, and then there's emptiness. The author Jack Higgins died last week. And he sold 50 million copies of one book that The Eagle Has Landed. But I mean, an amazingly successful author. And he was asked in a radio interview, what do you know at 60 that you wished you'd known at 16? And he wrote, I wished I'd known that when you get to the top, there's nothing there. So what do we do with that? Here's Michael Caine's autobiography. What's it all about? He says, it's a question I keep asking myself. So there I am. I'm 16, and I'm thinking, what is the point of this? There's death, there's meaning, there's selfishness. And at that point, I have to tell you, I didn't think the Christian faith was the answer. I didn't think it was worth celebrating in a banquet. But I had started going to a little communion service between my school and the next door girls' school. I was at a boys' school. There was a joint communion on a Friday. And I used to go, and the only reason I went is there was a very pretty girl called Emma Young who went. And I used to like watching her walk up and down the aisle to communion. I don't think she realizes she's the reason I'm now ordained. Anyway, there you have it. So one day I'm sitting in this communion waiting for Emma, who was 4 years older. I never spoke to her to walk up the aisle. And something was said which was the most influential thing said to me in 10 years at school. The speaker at the front said this: who is this man who in the Sermon on the Mount says, love your enemies, pray for those who persecute you, and then, as he's being judicially murdered on Good Friday, cries out for his killers, Father, forgive them, they don't know what they're doing. And I remember thinking, gosh, that's amazing. Because in my diary, I said one thing and I did another. But with Jesus, he says, love your enemies, pray for those who persecute you, and then he does it. He does it on the cross as he's being murdered. I remember thinking, gosh, that's amazing. And then there was a little Christian meeting at the school run by a maths teacher. And I started to understand what a banquet could be about. Because I went along to that meeting, and this maths teacher, he said, Rico, look, when Jesus got through death, he got through death so he can get you through. Now, my godfather had just been killed. So what I came to understand, and this is Easter Sunday, was Jesus lived and taught. He had a band of followers. He was tried in a Roman and Jewish court. He was sentenced to die. They strung him up on a cross. They sentenced him to die. They put a spear through his side. They took him off the cross. They certified him as dead. And ladies and gentlemen, 3 days later, he's walking around again. Now, if he got through death himself, he can get me through. That's the issue. My mum died in Basingstoke Hospital 10 years ago. I loved her very much. And as she was dying, I said 3 things to her. I said, goodbye. We'd all say that. I said, I love you. And then I said, I'll see you again. And you can give me all the money in the world or the knowledge that there will be a day of reunion with her, and I'll take Mum every time. I can't tell you, amidst COVID, the joy that there's been to speak to people and say, the last thing is never the worst thing if Christ has risen. Ladies and gentlemen, what do you make of that? There's a course beginning on the 24th, so not this Easter Sunday, though go along, but on the 24th, where you can ask questions about the resurrection of Jesus. Can he get me through death? Because actually the sort of New Testament teaching is that he's like, as it were, the sort of knife that goes through death, but then we sort of get pulled along like thread behind him. And that means I can see Mum again. It's massive. I just have to wait and hope for that day. But the past certainty gives me the future hope. What do you make of that? I'm holding the funeral card of my best mate from school here. I took his funeral. He developed cancer over lockdown and died. And wasn't diagnosed. It was the usual story. But, it was wonderful to read through Mark's gospel with him in the last weeks of his life. Secondly, what about meaning? Do you see what Solomon says here? Have a look back down at the bits of paper. Meaning, what's the meaning of life? He says, I wanted to see what was good for people to do under heaven during the few days of their lives. What is the meaning of it all? Well, here's another autobiography. This is Tolstoy's Confession. And in this book, he says, look, I spent my life looking for meaning. As a young man, I thought it was wine, women, and song as a soldier in Leningrad. He said that was fine, but it left me a bit empty. It was pleasurable, but I was empty. He said, then, I inherited my father's estates. I became one of the wealthiest men in all Russia. He said, still, there was great good I could do, but there was still emptiness. So he then says, so I decided the meaning in life was in fame. And then you get one of the coolest lines in literature, because he opens brackets and writes, so I wrote War and Peace. And he said, wherever I went, I was seen as a great man. I wrote War and Peace. But he said, still I felt empty. So he says, in 1872, I married and had 13 children, open brackets, this for a period put me off finding the meaning of life. You're not kidding. Can you imagine? 13 kids. But one day he was watching his little boy play, and he says, what meaning has my life that the inevitability of death doesn't destroy? My little boy's going to be dust. What's the point? And then, so often with Tolstoy, the peasants are the heroes. He watches a peasant farmer, and on one of his farms, he says, why are you like this? Why are you so joyful? Your life's miserable. And the farmer looks at him and says, Matthew 11, verse 28, Jesus says, come to me, all you who are weary and heavy laden, and I'll give you rest. And honestly, I found as I came into relationship with Jesus, I started to get meaning, purpose. Science can keep you alive, but it doesn't tell us why we should be alive. It's this relationship I found. Let some people look bored. Let's just, as we draw to a close, let's try and sort of change the tone a bit. Here we go. So, are we ready at the back? This is a chance to shine. Ready, sir? Are you coming? Oh, and back. Good hands here. He looked well. Okay, and coming. Oh, and back. Let's do it without the ball. Are you ready? And back. Are you ready? Do you know if there's no ball, the game loses its meaning, doesn't it? If there's no ball, fancy England playing France a month ago without a ball. Actually, it might have been better. But anyway, do you know what? I once threw one of these at a wedding, and I threw it, and as I let it go, I had a slight feeling of foreboding, and there was an 84-year-old woman called Mrs. Mott, and everyone leaned away, and I smacked her on the head, and she fell one way, and the blue hat fell the other. I thought, I've killed her. Anyway, after I'd done this, they wrote to my vicar, Richard Buse at All Souls, and they said, it was appalling. He threw this ball. He almost brained this old lady. And he wrote back and said, he's a very immature young man. Please pray for us as we train him. Okay, but do you know what? I found that Jesus became as central to life, ladies and gentlemen, as a ball is to a game. Now, a lot of people go, well, it's just the rules. You're going on about rules tonight. I'm not, although I think the rules are great. I think, God says don't steal because he's a giving God. He says don't lie because he's a God of truth. He says don't commit adultery because he's faithful. I think the rules are great. They're not fences that hem me in, they're foundations. But with Jesus, ladies and gentlemen, what we're going on about is a relationship. What do you make of that? And as I close, just to say, what about this diary? You see, as I kept this diary, I found that it wasn't just that I was cornered by my conscience, though I was. I found that I started going, how are you treating God, Rico? How are you treating God? Because what I found I was doing was taking the gifts of God, family, friends, food, falling in love, fitness, but ignoring the giver. And I hate it when people do that to me. And then I found, and I make no apology for this, that there would be a day when God would say, Rico, I was meant to be as central to your life as a ball is to a game. And Rico, did you get your wrongdoing forgiven? So unashamedly, I want to say, ladies and gentlemen, there is a day of judgment. Christians believe that. You can't get Easter unless you realize when he died on Good Friday, it was to save us from something. It's not just a Galilean carpenter dying. He dies on the cross so that I can be forgiven. So it's like, here I am, here's all I've done wrong, here's Jesus dying on the cross. The Bible says all we like sheep have gone astray, each has gone his own way, but the Lord has laid on him the wrongdoing of us all. My sin, that's the Bible, gets removed. Now again, just with Easter, can I just say, ladies and gentlemen, with Ukraine, I'm so glad there's a judgment to come. I mean, here's the front of the Times last week. Civilians shot in the street. Isn't it great that there'll be a day when we'll be held accountable, the human race? But it's also, God will also say, well, Rico, what about you? Do you know me? Have you had your wrongdoing forgiven? And I suddenly saw that when Jesus went to die tomorrow, Good Friday, he died for me. It became an extraordinary thing. I thought, gosh, he's died and paid in death and blood as my substitute to take the penalty in my place. Many years ago, I was playing rugby in Bristol against a club side called Dings Crusaders, and I arrived at the Dings ground. I saw my opposite number. He was massive. He was built like an outside loo. Honestly, you look at a guy like that and you think, what does his mother look like? I mean, the bloke was vast. I thought, this is going to be desperate. And I looked around, and he wasn't warming up at all. I thought, well, I wonder why that is. He had a number 3 on his back, but I looked around, and he was holding a tiny baby boy. And I thought, well, maybe he's not playing. Maybe he's babysitting. Maybe his mother's playing. I didn't know. Just before kickoff, he handed this baby across, and ladies and gentlemen, he ripped me limb from limb. Half time, doesn't go back to the huddle. He goes straight back to the baby boy. Second half, comes back on, throws me around like straw in the wind. As the final whistle goes and I stutter off, that baby boy is back in the man's arms. There was no question who the father was. There was no question who the son was. I'd like to have seen anyone lay a finger on that boy. It would have been amusing to behold the result. Now, here's the issue. At Easter, ladies and gentlemen, do you think God loved his son, Jesus Christ, any less than that man loved his little boy? Yet at Easter, on Good Friday, he sends him to die for me so that my diary gets sorted out. And then he raises him so that in the face of my death or my friend's death, I can have hope. And that's why there's a banquet. That's why there's a banquet. It's just the most staggering thing. And then Jesus rises and he says, I want to be as central to your life as a ball is to a game. In the last 40 years, on not one day have I had a problem with meaning. It is to serve Christ. I do it pathetically. It's pathetic. But it is such a joy. There's such a feeling of joy, honestly. And to serve someone, and you're in a story that goes on into eternity with loved ones. So, ladies and gentlemen, I don't know what you make of having a banquet now, the night before Good Friday. But I want to say I'm so thrilled to celebrate that I'm forgiven, that I have hope, that I have this relationship, and it all comes from Jesus. So what we're saying is, would you please come and look at him? Come on Easter Sunday. The services are 9:15 and 11:30. On the back here, they're there. Why not come and hear about Christ rising from the dead? And then the following week, the 24th, between the services, so there's a creche available, come and ask your questions at Christianity Explored. Your questions are so important. Please come and ask them the following week. Whatever question you've got, as unashamedly we open up one of the biographies of Jesus and have a look at him. But honestly, if this is true, it's worth the greatest banquet one could ever have. And the promise is there'll be a great banquet in eternity coming out of it. And it all comes from having a relationship with the person of Christ. So I hope you'll investigate, and thank you all very much for listening.